that Saint Brendan gave communion to a mermaid. That's actually the really tame later version of the story.
Okay.
It's actually much, much stranger than that. I mean, say, communing a mermaid, that's pretty
That's
believable.
pretty. Yes,
But
pretty believable.
but the thing that happens in this version of the story, this is really something else. So they had not gone far from there when they found a fair young maiden with golden tresses, as white as snow or the foam of the wave, lying dead from the thrust of a spear which had entered between her shoulders and come out between her two breasts. So this young, beautiful woman, stabbed in the back, killed, lying there dead on the ocean. Vast was the size of the maiden. She was 100 feet high,
What? Wait.
9 feet between her breasts. Her nose was 4 feet long, and her middle finger 7 feet long. Brendan restored her to life and baptizes her at once.
This is Jonathan Pedro. Welcome to the Symbolic World.
Hello, everyone. We are back here with Richard Rohlin. All of you know him really well. We are going to do our second pass at the Voyage of St. Brendan, that amazing, weird, and disturbing tale.
Yes.
And so Richard's going to take us along.
Well, and it took us a little bit of time to get around to this because I had a baby and then a flood. But it took St. Brendan 7 years to get back home, so I feel like we're actually pretty ahead of schedule. So.
Yeah, and I told Richard that I'm not sure, I don't know how much of it is true, but there is a rumor going around the symbolic world that we call it something like the St. Christopher curse, maybe. Or the St. Christopher blessing, I'm not sure. It seems like people involved in the symbolic world, and especially around the story of God's dog and St. Christopher, seem to have floods. And so,
Yeah, I think it's got a sort of initiatory quality.
It's a rite of
that's for sure.
passage.
Oh my gosh. Well, okay, so speaking of floods, when we last left our heroes, right, St. Brendan is out on the water. St. Brendan actually takes 2 voyages in the life of St. Brendan, or at least the version of it that we've been reading. Again, this comes from Christopher Plummer, not Christopher Plummer. Christopher Plummer's an actor. This comes from Charles Plummer's Life of the Irish Saints. And so that'll be kind of the version that I'm reading from today. There are other versions of the Voyage of St. Brendan, but this particular one is pretty old, and it works in a lot of kind of interesting details that I think get omitted later. And I think part of the reason they get omitted later on is because some of them are just really weird. They're really strange. You don't know what to do with them. And if you're trying to take the story and retell it in a coherent way, in a way that feels like it's like a narrative, some of these things can be a little bit frustrating. Fortunately, I am not burdened with the need to do that today. So I'm just going to read some weird things to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing that we left on last time was this idea of celebrating Pascha or celebrating Easter on the back of the monster.
Yeah.
And this is an idea that sort of I come back around to over and over again in my imagination. I especially think about, Pascha during, Pascha 2020 and what happened that year, where we weren't able to be in church. And then, how were we supposed to keep the feast in that year? And actually, what we did at my house is that we had friends came over, and we just did a reader service, and we did like the whole midnight office for Pascha and everything else. So we lit candles and we processed around the house. And honestly, as rough as that year was, that is one of my favorite memories. I mean, it was just really, really blessed. And afterwards, we had a bunch of food, and I don't want to trivialize how difficult and traumatic that year was for everyone, but at the same time, there was this kind of, the sense of being out on the waves that year. And so this is the story. This is how it goes. When, however, Easter drew near, Brendan's company began to say to him that he should land for the celebration of Easter. And the interesting thing is that there are, if you read the whole Voyage of St. Brendan, there are multiple times where they're serving the Mass like basically every day on the boat. But the idea is, and keep in mind, these are skin boats. Boats made out of skin, which, as we're going to see, is actually really significant in the story in a way that I think you're going to like. And so they're serving Mass every day, but it's Pascha is coming up, so we need to like have we need to have a fixed place. We need to find land so we can celebrate Easter. So God is able, said Brendan, to find a land for us in any place he pleases. When then Easter came, a great whale raised its shoulders high above the surface of the waves so that it formed dry land. And then they landed and celebrated Easter on it. And they were there 1 day and 2 nights. When they had entered their boats, the whale dived into the sea once more. However, it was thus that they celebrated Easter to the end of 7 years on the back of the sea monster. So it's either that St. Brendan's first voyage is 5 years and his second voyage is 2, or the first one is 7 years and the second one is 2. There's numbers are one of the most difficult things to translate from old manuscripts, and so there are places where the manuscripts kind of disagree. But in any case, they spend at least 7 Easters like this, 7 Paschas like this. Mm-hmm. For when it was near Easter each year, it would lift its back above the sea, forming dry land. Now, this story would mean something very different. I mean, obviously, to modern people, we're just, the story just sort of bounces off of us. We're like, oh, that's weird. How could that even happen? How could that be a real thing? But this would mean something very different to somebody in the Middle Ages because of what whales mean, right? What a whale is. I mean, a whale is really a sea monster. Yeah. And you can definitely imagine if you're sailing along the North Atlantic in a little boat made out of animal skins and you see a whale, I mean, that is potentially extremely bad news, right? And so there's a couple of old sources that you can go to for how whales were viewed. I'll just give a couple here. This is from a 2nd century Latin kind of bestiary or book of natural history with what we would consider to be like biology or something like that now. And it says that there is a monster in the sea, which in Greek is called an aspidodecaline. I got that wrong. Aspidochelone. There we go. In Latin, the asp turtle. It is a great whale that has what appears to be beaches on its hide, like those from the seashore. This creature raises its back above the waves of the sea so that sailors believe that it is just an island, so that when they see it, it appears to them to be a sandy beach, such as is common along the seashore. Believing it to be an island, they beach their ship alongside it, and disembarking, they plant stakes and tie up the ships. Then, in order to cook a meal after this work, they make fires on the sand as if on land. But when the monster feels the heat of these fires, it immediately submerges in the water and pulls the ship into the depths of the sea. So this is like some kind of a large turtle or some kind of a large whale. In the Alexander Romance, which
yeah, there definitely is this. There definitely is that story.
Yeah, in the Alexander Romance, it says they landed on the so-called island. In an hour passed, suddenly it proved to be no island, but a monster which plunged into the sea. We shouted, and it disappeared. But some of my companions met a wretched death. Among them, my best friend. That's Alexander writing to Aristotle.
Yeah. So you see it. You find that in the story of Sinbad. There's a lot of old stories that have this.
Yeah, this idea is kind of surprisingly well documented, you could say. Make of that what you will.
Yeah.
All the crypto bros, by which I mean like the cryptozoology bros, not the bored monkeys bros, but get in the comments. I mean, so if you read medieval bestiaries, then what they do with this idea is they see the whale as actually a type of the devil, right? And that the devil sort of, or a type of the passions, right? This thing that sort of deceives you into thinking it's one thing, into thinking it's solid land, into thinking, that you're going to be safe here, that you can rest here, that you can eat here, and then it dives beneath the sea and it takes you down with it, right? That's the basic idea. So then knowing that this is a kind of a common understanding in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages, we have this, like, what do you do with this story? So this is where I present the weird thing, and then I pass it over to you, Jonathan. But no, you can sort of say, like, what do you do with this story that basically it's the devil, right? Basically, it's the passions. Basically, it's the thing that you spend your entire life actually as a monk trying to get away from, trying to escape, trying to defeat. And that's the miracle that comes every year so you can celebrate Easter.
Yeah, but I think that the way to understand it is to see it in a wider in a wider frame. That is, that in some ways it's an image also of resurrection, right?
Yeah.
It's an image of basically body being pulled out of the water. It's an image of creation, of the first creation. When God can calls the dry land out of the sea. So I think that it's that makes sense for it to be there at Pascha. I think there's also an image of the defeat of death, but you can understand the defeat of death in many ways, sometimes as like spearing the monster, but also the walking on water is part of this idea of Christ defeating death. So I think that's why all of these images come together. So you can understand it like just in the same way that all the images of the body are often associated with the passions, because of the fact that the body tends to pull our attention towards it and then can kind of enslave our attention in different ways. But then the body is also positive, right? It is also the gathering of matter towards purpose and stuff. So I think in this case, what we're seeing is, of course, the positive aspect of the symbolism, which is the gathering of the potential, and then it appears as firm ground on which to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. And then it goes away after that. So to me, that's what I would think.
And I always think about, I mean, in ancient Christianity in both the East and the West, the thing that you read on Holy Saturday is the story of Jonah. That's the thing you read on Holy Saturday. We know they were doing this, by the way, in the Latin Church as well, because Augustine writes about Saint Augustine writes about it. But there is also, I think, some kind of connection here with the story of Jonah, right, and with the idea that the sea monster that swallows Jonah is death, right? It's the Leviathan, it's death, it's all those different things, but then also it's the thing that God made and ordained for that particular time, and God commands it to do things, right? And so, I mean, there's this image in the Psalm, talking about Leviathan, where the idea is that Leviathan is this is in Psalm 103. It's that God made the sea and then Leviathan to play in it, right? And the idea is actually that the sea is God's mixing bowl, or just to weird people out, I think really in Hebrew it's like his divination cup, and the Leviathan is just like his little pet goldfish, that kind of plays around in the water there, right? And so we definitely see some of this here. It's very much, listen, we're waiting for God to provide. Don't worry, God will provide for himself a land. See, it's a little yeah.
So I think that all of that it makes total sense.
Yeah.
Like the idea of the land that comes out of the water. If you think about how at the end of the story of Noah, they end up on a mountain. That's also an image of like the land that comes out of the waters. But there's also some aspect of maybe this strange symbolism of the idea, how the Leviathan is defeated in the end, and how the sea monster, like the feast of the sea monster that is there in some of the Hebrew traditions, like the idea that Leviathan is that we're actually going to eat Leviathan at the end and wear the skins and all that type of imagery.
That's okay. This happens in this story too. So
so we're good. We're good.
Yeah, we're good. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the next story that I want to tell is the story of, you'll have heard sometimes, and I think we even put this in the thumbnail for the last video we did on the life of St. Brendan, that St. Brendan gave communion to a mermaid. That's actually the really tame later version of the story.
Okay.
It's actually much, much stranger than that. I mean, communing a mermaid, that's pretty believable.
That's pretty believable.
The thing but the thing that happens in this version of the story, this is really something else. So They had not gone far from there when they found a fair young maiden with golden tresses, as white as snow or the foam of the wave, lying dead from the thrust of a spear which had entered between her shoulders and come out between her two breasts. So this young, beautiful woman, stabbed in the back, killed, lying there dead on the ocean. Vast was the size of the maiden. She was 100 feet high.
What? Wait.
9 feet between her breasts. Her nose was 4 feet long, and her middle finger 7 feet long. Brendan restored her to life and baptizes her at once.
This is it, folks. This might just be the culmination of my life's work. Join me for the Symbolism Masterclass this April 2025. During this course, I'll take you by the hand into the essentials and depth of symbolic thinking. Over 6 weeks and over 18 hours of lectures and Q&As in a concise and comprehensive way, I'll teach you everything about how I think so that by the end you might see the world anew. This class will not only be an introduction, but also a deep dive into a way of seeing that cuts right through our secular dead end. It reconnects the ancient religious ideas with some of the most cutting-edge notions of complexity developed today. As the world is shaking and changing at an increasingly rapid pace, being able to read the patterns of reality will give you an anchor and a solid sense of what is up and what is down. In this class, we will talk about so many things about heaven and earth, the sacred and the secular, the Bible, dragons, demons, fairies. We'll explore the surprising value of conspiracy theories, how symbolic patterns are found in movies, in science, philosophy, art. We'll look at the relationship of symbolism to natural selection. We'll look at the basic patterns of the world, of sacrifice, of the center, the margin, the masculine, the feminine, the mountain, time and space, left and right. It will be a synthesis of everything I've covered in the 500 YouTube videos that I put out over the years, and much more as well. Now all in a structure that has one purpose, which is to make you a master of symbolic thinking. This is your opportunity to get to the core of what symbolism is, to ask questions, to test out your ideas, and to make sure you have a strong foundation of the fundamentals, plus getting some hidden gems that I've never shared before. So don't miss out on the live experience and register today. Yeah, we're missing that part. We're missing the giant part, huh?
Uh-huh. He asked her further of her race, and she said, I am of the dwellers of the sea. So she's not described here as a mermaid.
Yeah.
But she's a kind of like you could say, like an undine. She's some kind of a giant.
Because she doesn't have, it doesn't say that she has a tail.
Yeah. And you'd think that they would mention that in the description, which is like fairly exact otherwise.
Yeah.
There's no tail mentioned, but she's a giant from the depths of the sea. She's like a titan, right?
Yeah.
Like a sea nymph, something like that, right? And he asked further of her race. She said, I am of the dwellers of the sea, said she, the folk who pray and entreat for resurrection.
What?
So what does that mean?
What? She's saying she's a remainder from before the flood? Is that what she's saying?
That seems to be what she is saying.
Oh my goodness.
And I just want the audience to know that Jonathan had a chance to look at notes before this, like so that he would be prepared for this stuff. And he's like, we'll just go.
I am not prepared for any of this.
Oh my God.
So they're suggesting that she is a Nephilim from before the flood, and that she has this desire to return. Like she has the desire to be saved, basically, that she.
So this is the thing. The thing about, you could say, like fairies or fey creatures, whatever they are, the monsters, the fairies, the she in Celtic storytelling. This is the thing that they're always really concerned about, which is there salvation for me?
Yeah.
Right. There's a famous collection of eyewitness accounts of people who ran into fairies, and then somebody went around and collected all the stories. And the question the fairies always have whenever they meet a Christian is there, can we be saved? Can we be baptized? Can we be resurrected? And the answer to this question usually is
No.
that can't be known until the day of
Okay.
judgment.
But Brendan seems to be like, nah, we're good.
Yeah, but I mean, like, Brendan is doing this.
I'm gonna resurrect the dead. She's dead. It's not like he found her in trouble or she was dead.
And if she's a giant we're sort of reading in here, but I mean, like, if she's like a giant from before the flood or whatever, you'd have to be like, well, she's dead. Who killed her? Like, probably
a big spear, coming from heaven, piercing her through her back.
So
This
Brendan
is
restores
crazy
her to
stuff,
life,
man.
baptizes her, and then asks her this. He says, do you want to go to heaven or do you want to go back to your own country? Do you want to go to heaven at once, which would mean you die now? Or do you want to go back to your own country? There's like back to wherever, the deeps, which is also hell. And so, like, where do you want to go? And she answered in a language which no one but Brendan understood. And said, to heaven, in truth, said she, for I hear the voices of the angels praising together the mighty Lord. And so, after receiving the body and blood of Christ, she died there without a struggle and was buried honorably by Brendan.
Wow.
And that is the story.
Yes, that's some wild stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
And we thought St. Christopher had all that, and it's like it's
all over
the place.
It's obviously, like, that's an insane story, and I would like caution people against trying to take this to your priest and be like, okay,
sure,
like, like don't probably don't put this like make an icon and put it in your church of this unless you live in Ethiopia where you can probably get away with it, but. The rest of the episode is just going to be Jonathan.
It's going to be laughing hysterically forever. Yeah. Wow, but this is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to maybe mention is that this is right after they met. They ran into like big whirlpools, like big boiling whirlpools, which threatened to kind of like suck them down, which feels like a moment from the Odyssey a little bit. And then right after that is when the devil shows up to Brendan's boat. And the devil shows up to Brendan's boat and settles on the mast in front of Brendan. Only Brendan can see him. It says, Brendan then asked the devil why he had come before his proper time, that is before the time of the resurrection, the day of judgment. So the resurrection, the day of the resurrection is like it's the big thing that is looming all throughout the life of St. Brendan. That's the big thing everyone is looking forward to. So whenever somebody says they're going to die, or they want to ask Brendan, where are they going to die? What they will say is, where will I have my resurrection? Mm-hmm. Right? Which is to say, like, this is the place my body is going to wait until the resurrection. Mm-hmm. The devil said at once, to be tortured in the depths of this black, dark sea am I come. Brendan then asked him, how so? Where is that infernal place? Sad is that, said the devil, that no one can see it and survive. However, the devil showed Brendan the door of hell, and he saw its pains and miseries. Then his company asked the holy monk, who art thou talking with? Said they. Brendan told them what he saw, and told them some small portion of the pains which we have said he saw, as is found in the writings of the Old Testament. Which writings of the Old Testament which talk about the pains of hell, you ask? This is probably the book of Enoch.
Yeah, okay. Because I was gonna say, like, where is it described?
Yeah, which is definitely kind of part of the Old Testament in Ireland at this time, at least as far as we can tell. The pains of hell are not actually described in the Old Testament, unless you want to say maybe in the Psalms. But then in that case, usually they would just say the Psalms. Like the Psalms are kind of their own thing. All right. Then said one of his company to Brendan, let me see some of those pains. On being permitted to see the varied pains of hell, he died forthwith and said, as he expired, woe, woe, said he, for all who have come and shall come into this prison. Thereupon Brendan prayed and restored to life his companion who had died. So this is the story that comes right before, and it says they had not gone far from there when they found the fair young maiden.
Okay, so
right? And so,
the order is
yeah,
this is before the mermaid,
yeah, this is before they find the sea giantess
and
or
it's
whatever you want to issue.
after the whale story.
Yeah, yeah.
Are you skipping stories, or are they actually this is just the order
I
of the
am
stories?
skipping in this particular case, it's whale story, whirlpools, devil shows us the pains of hell, which are in the depths of the sea,
Yeah.
and then we meet the giantess, who is from the people who live in the depths of the sea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so, especially like with the sort of like the Enochian background to this, I think there's zero chance that this isn't supposed to be a reference to one of the giants
Of
from before the
course, because
flood.
it just
Yeah,
all of it
like it all
seems
flows in, and yeah.
wow.
So that's and I do want to say I don't think that this story would have happened in Ireland, right? This is the sort of thing, that could only happen out on the sea, right? In this kind of this liminal place
In America.
in America. In America.
Richard Kennan doesn't know how to answer. On the way to America. Yeah.
On the way to
On the
America. I
way to
mean,
America.
yeah. Uh,
But definitely, I mean, I think it's important to notice how coherent a lot of the images are in the sense of what it is
that's
to be
right.
on the ocean and what it is to be not only sailing on the ocean, but sailing west towards the edge of the world, and how all of these ideas of both, this notion of a kind of new creation with the whale coming out on the resurrection, at the same time, the idea of this monster that's lost on the edge of the world, that is a remainder of the old world, but is also being saved and resurrected, and the devil as well. I mean, the idea that the devil is in the West is not that
Right.
is not that ridiculous,
Yeah.
right?
The devil's in the west, hell is at the bottom of the sea.
Yeah.
But also like, when Brendan so okay, this is like a poorly formed thought, but let me try to put it out there for you. So there's this thing where Brendan he's meeting this woman, and it's not clear if they meet her on an island or if she's just sort of floating in the water,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But she's from the depths of the sea, which as we've just established is where the door to hell is, right? Which is good biblical imagery as well. So we have this door to hell, and then there's heaven up there, hell down here, and there's nothing really in between because we're just on the water.
Yeah.
But the thing that we meet is sort of like one of these sort of in between creatures, right? She's like some kind of a monster. In this case, she's a giant. In later versions of the story, she's a mermaid, or at least that's a vision, a version that's entered popular legend. But there's you could, I mean, the idea of like a giantess who like lives at the bottom of the sea is a pretty common image in seafaring cultures, especially in Northern Europe. And so she's from a race of people who have been imprisoned in hell. That seems to be the case. And so then Brendan basically gives her the option, like, where do you want to go? But you can't stay in the middle anymore. Like, it seems to be something like that. The fairy thing really bothers people. Like people are always wanting to know, like, what's the deal with fairies? Do they really exist? I mean, and the thing to understand is that question is what a fairy is.
Yeah. That's right.
Like people, and so people will kind of object to this, and
Because even the idea of fairies asking whether or not they can be saved is
Right.
asking something like,
That is what
do
a fairy
fairies
is.
actually exist? That's right.
Right, exactly. Because in the end, that's actually it's between existence and non-existence. That's right. So there's always the funny thing is that whenever I've definitely seen clergy sort of roll their eyes. Oh, this question again. Why are people asking this? This is probably Jonathan Peugeot's fault. People are asking these questions, and and they'll be like, well, nothing is really nothing could. There's no such thing as an in between thing, right? That's right. And that is actually always the answer that in the stories the clergy tell. That's what they always tell the fairy.
Yeah.
Like, that's the right answer for a priest to give to that question.
Yeah. The problem is that I think that that's right. The best way to think about it is I think that that's true. You
Right.
could say something like, there's no such thing as an in-between thing in the eschaton.
Right.
But now, sadly, we deal with that problem. Like, we deal with the idea that there's no judgment yet. There's no final judgment in order to put things completely in their place. And so we we deal with, in some ways, it's a consequence of sin. Right? The idea of unformed things or malformed things or things that are half formed is a consequence of
Yeah.
sin, because that's what sin is. That it's basically not hitting the target, not not having a clear identity, or having a mitigated or a confused identity. So we have to know how to deal with this stuff, in the world. And in the scriptures there are stories that talk about this. The story of the saving of the mermaid, is really the story of the saving of the Ethiopian eunuch
Right.
in the story in the Acts, because it's very similar, and it happens, it happens on the edge, and this encounter with a man who is from very far away, who looks very different from us, but is also castrated, and so is like a kind of
Like a half a man, or
half a
something like
man,
that.
or a confused identity. And then the whole story of it going into the water, and then Philip, disappearing into the heavens like Elijah, and leaving behind this being that's like kind of like the garment of skin, like this being who's there. All of this is what that story is about. And so we have several stories in scripture, but then of course the St. Christopher story as well, that talk about how, what is the role of these intermediary things in the meantime, before the last judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so I think what you said is really important, and I just want to emphasize it. It's that these episodes seem like they're just random things, but if you just take them together, it's very clear that part of this cohesive picture of life and death and the resurrection and Easter and hell and heaven, and like kind of all of these opposites, with Brendan kind of being the thing that it is in there, in between all of them, mediating them.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is what saints do.
Yeah, and it's also, I think the one thing too to understand is that in some ways, think about how when Adam names the animals, you have to understand when the animal presents itself to Adam, in some ways it is not completely formed. There's something
Right.
missing to it. It is a question, it's presenting itself, but it still needs to be named and to be stabilized. And so we can understand that that's why humans, we struggle with the monsters. We've lost in some ways the God-given capacity to fully be able to do that, to always mediate God, to mediate reality, to be able to name things. So we have in some ways, like I said, a consequence of sin, which is that now sometimes we have to face things that are ambiguous and aren't clear. But this is a temporary thing. At the end of time, the sea becomes glass, and all identity everything becomes a reflection of the divine order.
Yeah. So there's some more weird stories that happen on the there's a couple of more things that happen to Brendan. They're not very long, and I won't get into them right now, but they have to do with, they just have to do with sweet water and bitter water, and they have to do with dry well. Okay, let's just talk about it.
It's important. This is good stuff.
Yeah, okay. All right. So the first thing we find, the next place that we go is we find this beautiful island, very lofty, but no harbor in which to land. So Brendan's company decides to, decide to kind of coast around the island for a week, see if they can find a place to land. They're not able to, but it says that while they're doing this, they hear in the island that they can't land on, the voices of men praising the Lord, and they see in it a fair and noble church. So after hearing the sound of the voice of the island folk, Brendan and his company slept a spiritual sleep. And as they were not admitted to the island, a waxed tablet. This is a weird detail, by the way. A waxed tablet. There's not a lot of writing in this story, but usually when there is, you come across a book. This is like a wax tablet, which is be something you would use to like do your draft work on, right? A wax tablet was let down to them with writing on it to this effect: labor not to enter this island, for you will never enter it, but the island which you seek, remember, they're looking for paradise, ye shall find, and this is not it. Depart to thine own land, O Brendan, that is, go back to Ireland, for there are many seeking thee who would fain see thee, and search the holy scriptures in which it is said, many are the mansions of God, as if it said, many places and abodes has the Lord beside this island. And after this, they turn away from the island, taking with them that wax tablet as a sign of the island folks' welcome and care for them. And it was read aloud to them every day as if it had been from God that it was sent to them. So it's this idea that there's something holy going on here, but it's not something Brendan and his men are meant to have a part of. And so it's sort of like, don't worry about what we're doing. We're not what you're looking for. Actually go back to your own homeland. But then eventually you are going to find the thing which you seek, which is the earthly paradise.
This is a really interesting, especially if it's compared to the other stories. And so you could say that in this case, this identity, like this world that is appearing to them, because it doesn't have a way in. There's no border. Like there's no buffer between that and where they are. So because of that, they can't access it. There's no port.
Yeah.
There's no way in. And so it has a kind of completeness to it, but it's completely unavailable to them because it's separate. Like it's a thing that's separate from their world. And so it's interesting because in some ways it can show you a little bit the positive aspect of the intermediary, like the need for an intermediary, because without some kind of access to the outside, then there's no possibility of having communion. There's no possibility of communication or of dealing with them. And I love how on the wax tablet, it's super interesting. It's almost saying like, we're a complete thing in itself. Like we're one of the mansions in God's kingdom. But we're just not yours, and you don't have access to us. And basically, go find your thing, and don't worry about us. We're good. We're good.
Yeah.
Super interesting.
Probably some lessons that could be taken from that as we interact with each other as Christians, especially on the internet, and especially, just constantly worrying about what other people are up to and what they're doing and all those things.
Yeah, and also I think the idea that, how can I say this? Like the idea that this is the best way to think about it. The idea is that there's a fullness in what we participate in. Doesn't mean that there is no fullness anywhere else. It just means that it's not like, can I say this? Like, it doesn't take away from the fullness of the things we participate in. If we can see from afar that there's a kind of fullness that isn't connected to ours. Right. So the idea is, what I'm trying to get to is something like, we know that the Holy Spirit is in the church and the Holy Spirit works, but that doesn't mean that God is not present in other places that are mysterious and not available to us,
Yeah, and I mean, the fact that this is what they run into right after they run into the giantess is also, because like who knows actually what's on that island? Is this more, it almost seems, if I had to hazard a guess, I would say that whatever is on that island is not actually human.
Mm-hmm.
Like like everybody that we run into in this whole section of the story is either an angel or a demon or something, in between. But we don't run into any humans.
Yeah.
In this part of the voyage. And if I had to guess, that's what I would say we're meant to understand there. But I mean, it's just a guess, because the whole point is whatever is here, it's not for you. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Go home, read the scriptures, and just accept that there are things that God has for you that aren't here.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great, even in terms of understanding how reality works, it's such a great image, and it's a great image to understand how exactly, like the idea, the capacity we have to define things does not encompass them completely. There are types of identities and types of intelligences that we don't necessarily master, or that we don't have access to, and that's also like, okay, it's okay. We can also just let them be. In God's Dog, we have this idea about the monsters. Like we say, there are three kinds of monsters, right? The kind you kill, the kind you tame, and the kind you leave alone. And I feel like this is a version of that, but not in terms of monsters, in terms of identities or worlds. Like there are worlds that you can encounter, right? There are worlds that can defeat you, or that you can defeat, but there are also worlds that are just not. They're just not available to you,
Yeah, it's not available to you. Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
okay.
Yep. I think it's part of the temptation of modernity, and this is really part of the spirit of Babel, is this desire to try to make everything integrate, everything cohere, like gather everything into one place under one, and that's obviously that's something that will be in the eschaton,
Yeah, yeah.
like it'll be there in the resurrection. But if we try to do it under our own steam, then that's what the mark of the beast is.
And I think there's something really relevant right now, like in terms of the whole psychedelics question, like that
Mhm.
idea of what it is that they encounter, what the experience they have there, where they can see the coherence of a world. But basically it's not their world and there's no way in. And in some ways they
Right.
just have to go back to your world and go back to your thing. And don't worry about it,
Yeah. All right. So the last thing that happens before Brendan's first voyage ends, it says they're out on the ocean rowing when a violent thirst seizes them, so that they well nigh died. Then they saw fair streams of water distilling and dropping from the crags. The brethren asked, "May we drink some of yonder water?" said they. "Bless it first," said Brendan, "to ascertain what it is." When they had blessed the water and chanted Alleluia over it, which, by the way, is also how we bless the water for baptism in the Eastern Church. I don't know what they would have done at this time, although there's some weird Greek liturgy references in the story, which we'll get to in a minute. But they bless the water, they chant Alleluia over it, and then the streams dried up at once, and they saw the devil darting from the water, and he would kill all who drank of it. Thus were Brendan's company saved by his power, and their thirst vanished at once, and the place was closed upon the devil that he might do no harm to any man thenceforth. So it's like the island sort of swallows the devil up.
Wow. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
very interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's another version of the story we just saw, but in the sense that this one is negative. Like the other one, it's
Yeah.
more like here are some possibilities. Here's a world that exists, like type of coherence that's just not yours. Like just don't
Yeah.
bother with it. Go do your thing and be content with what you have. And here it's actually an island or a world that its source is poison to you. Like it will
Yeah.
actually destroy you.
Yeah. And then there's some interesting kind of baptismal imagery there. Again, like one of the things we do to prepare water for baptism is to bless it and to basically sort of kick the devil out of the waters,
Yeah.
right? Which is this very ancient idea, which you have here, which we've seen kind of multiple times.
But here the idea is that it's only the devil. So once they kick the
Yeah.
devil out of the waters,
The
the
water
water
dries up.
goes
Yeah.
away. It basically shrivels up.
But
So
also
they-
they're not thirsty anymore afterwards.
So
it's like-
think about it. We could take a lot of the stories that we just heard and we could interpret them through baptism, right? Which is in some ways the idea of certain things that are encountered in the world. And we say Christianity baptizes other cultures, like we say that,
Right.
But the idea would be something like there are some things in
That's
other cultures.
sloppy language and it annoys me, but we'll go with it.
Yeah, but you've heard
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah, I know,
So
I know,
you
I
can
know.
you can think that
Probably
there are
said
some
that.
things that can be baptized and come out of the waters, right? There are some things that are just completely separate, like that are not related to the question at all, and there are some things that can be
That
can
you
be
just can't
baptized.
integrate. You
Yeah,
just
that
can't
just
integrate.
stay in the water. They're basically a poisonous source
Yeah.
for the world that you're participating in.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, this conversation is really helping me see the way those four stories are all really
connected.
coherent with each other.
Yeah.
It's great. So, Brendan has been on the water at this point for either 5 or 7 years, and he makes it back. With the instructions in the wax tablet, he turns around, goes back to Ireland. Importantly, interesting things don't happen to you on the way back home; they only happen to you on the way out. So he gets back to Ireland pretty quickly. And once he makes it back, he goes to first his foster father, who's an abbot, and then he goes to Ita, his foster mother, who is a nun and was basically the woman that raised him. And he goes to her for counsel. She seems to be a very wise woman. This is not the first or the last time Brendan will go to her for counsel. And he basically says, "What should I do? I tried to get to the earthly paradise. It's not happening." And so, of course, after Ita has greeted him as one would have greeted Christ and his apostles if they showed up. This is how, in the Irish hagiography, this is how you make this is how you say you made a big deal over somebody when they show up. You greet them as you would greet Christ and his apostles themselves if they'd showed up. That's the kind of feasting. That's the kind of merriment. That's the kind of hospitality. And then she says, "Ah, dearly beloved son, why did you go out on your journey without taking counsel from me? For the country you are seeking from God, you'll never find on these dead, soft skins, that is, on these skin boats you've been sailing in. For it is a holy and consecrated land, and no blood of men was ever shed in it." I knew you were going to like this part.
Oh.
And so she says, "Let timber boats be made by thee, and belike thou wilt find that land on this wise." Thereupon Brendan went into the region of Connacht, and an excellent large boat was made by him. And he embarked with his company and people, and they took various herbs and seeds to store the boat withal, and the wrights and smiths who had prayed Brendan to let them go with him.
Interesting.
So Brendan finds out that the reason he couldn't find paradise is because you can't get to paradise on a boat of skin.
Yeah. Ah, wow. I mean, that's amazing. For those who know, of course, the story of Moses and St. Gregory of Nyssa's telling of the life of Moses, the removing of the garments of skin is such an important part of going into paradise. Just as Adam and Eve put on garments of skin in order to be protected outside in the world of the fall, in order to go back into the holy place, you have to remove the garments of skin, especially imaged as the sandals, right? These skins that you wear under your feet that Moses removes when he goes into the holy place. And so it's a wonderful image. And also what's interesting about it is it also seems to refer, to the ark, to some extent, because it emphasizes the fact that he builds a boat, but then he gathers these people and these things and these seeds into the ark. And also it's funny because in the Gilgamesh version of the Ark, that's what happens, right? In the Gilgamesh version, it's not just animals, but it explicitly says that he brings craftsmen and all the different crafts, like a representative of all the different crafts get gathered into the Ark as well.
I hope that people are paying attention to, how do I say this? The stuff that you and your brother have been talking about for years, like you didn't just like make that stuff up one day. Like it's so fundamental to the pattern of the world that you find it in every single ancient story, right? And so even basic things like, well, obviously you can't get to paradise wearing your garments of skin, but also this idea that you could build something, like you could build an ark. Right, of course, we talk about the church. Like, what is the church? The church is the ark of salvation. So what happens after this is they go back out on the water, and the very first thing that happens, so there's this note about taking the wrights, WRIGHTS, like the craftsmen, right, and the smiths who had prayed Brendan to let them go with them. So they're begging him. They build him this boat, and then they basically say, "You got to let us come with you." And he says, "Okay." The very first thing that happens once they get out on sea is that the smith gets sick and he's going to die. So this is their blacksmith. He gets sick and he's going to die. And Brendan says, basically, like, you shouldn't be surprised this is happening. Depart to the heavenly kingdom, right? Or if you want to, I'll heal you and you can stay here, like in this life. And the smith says, "I hear the voice of the Lord calling me." So the smith dies, and they don't have anywhere to bury him. Obviously, there's no island or anything like that. And so the brothers say, basically, like, where are we going to put this guy? And Brendan says, "It's no trouble. Let's just bury him in the sea." Now, the idea of like a sea burial, I think it's like a kind of a given for modern people. Like if somebody dies while you're at sea, you do the ceremony that we've all at least seen in movies, right? You do the ceremony and then you toss people didn't do this in the ancient world, right? Like, because to toss the body into the sea and it's not a Christian burial. It's not an appropriate way to dispose of a body, right? So you need to bury the body in land. So then the question is, what are we going to do with this guy? And what Brendan says is, he who made the heaven and the earth and the other elements has power over the waves of the sea to fix the corpse immovably in them. So then the smith who was buried among the waves of the sea without drifting to land and without rising to the surface of the brine, without moving in any direction, as if he were in the ground, as one said, And I should mention there's a bunch of old Irish poetry interspersed all throughout the life of St. Brendan. And the normal case in stories like this is called prosometrical literature, where basically you have prose and then you have meter, right? The meter, the poetry, is almost always older. And what people are doing is telling the stories that people would have remembered. They're writing down the stories that come between the poems, right? And so we get a poem, and this is probably like a 6th century Irish poem. They bury him, though it was wondrous, the smith in the ocean, amid the waves of the wild sea, without sinking under the roar of the billows. And it's very clear there that the body of the smith is like buried under the waves, but not like he didn't sink to the bottom
Yeah,
of
he
the ocean.
kind of stayed there in the middle.
He's not floating around. It's just like they buried him 6 feet under, and he kind of stays fixed in that place. And so they bring the smith from the old world, like, to paradise, but then, like, immediately, first thing that happens is the smith gets sick and dies. And they bury him in the ocean, and his body sort of becomes this fixed point, this anchor in the sea. And this is important because the next thing that happens is that they show up at this island, and so they drop the anchor at the island. They're about to unload, and then it says the harbor was filled with demons in the shapes of dwarves and leprechauns. So if you were wondering, when are the leprechauns coming along?
Here they
are. And Brendan says, go ahead and bring the anchor up again. Let's get out of here, because no one can enter this land but he who shall wage human war against demons and shed blood over them. And the idea seems to be like the demons here have taken this physical form, and we don't want to fight them with human weapons. This is not how monks fight demons. It's a little so.
What is that? Let me ask you a question. Like, what is the difference between a dwarf and a leprechaun? I mean, I have the cliche image of it. You know? It's like the leprechaun guard the pot of gold and stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
it's more of a trickster figure.
Yeah, I mean, the idea, you shouldn't be thinking of like when you, well, first of all, when you hear dwarf, you shouldn't be thinking of like dwarves from like Middle Earth, like Tolkien dwarves, right? You know, dwarf here is something like, if there's a difference between like elves, dwarves, leprechauns in the, at this particular time, right, in the 6th century or whatever, it's not really at all clear to us. So but the idea is like dwarves are this thing that are kind of from under the sea. And then, whereas a leprechaun is the sort of fairy that will, like, if you, I said dwarves live under the earth and they do the forging, right? So in that sense, they're like Tolkien's dwarves, but also not really at all like Tolkien's dwarves, because they can shapeshift and they're tricksters and all these other things. But then leprechauns are, they are a kind of spirit or like fairy associated with the sea, and they can. The classic story is that you sort of fall asleep on the beach, and then you wake up and the leprechauns are dragging you into the ocean. But if you can capture them, then you get the wishes. So that part of the story is pretty old. But like the pot of gold, little green jacket, all that stuff, much later.
A little later, yeah.
But the question here is like, is it really fairies or is it demons that look like fairies? Because it says demons in the shapes of dwarves and leprechauns opposing them. And people sometimes seem to have the idea that, okay, well, you could either say fairies are this in-between thing, or they're always demons. But in this story, it really seems like sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
I mean,
definitely...
it makes sense in terms of experience, because demons are always represented also as a intermediary thing, because they're in some ways something that has no substance which suddenly has substance. Like the aspect of their demon aspect, which is the negative aspect of principality, is manifesting itself. But how is that possible? Like, how does evil have body? How does evil have being? It's not supposed to. But then that's the strange thing about the twisting and the fall, So and the way we represent demons in the Western tradition, especially, is as these ambiguous kind of hybrid creatures that have different parts of different animals
Right.
and stuff. So they,
And maybe they want to steal you away, or they want to steal your soul
yeah,
away, but also like there is an association about the dwarves, between the dwarves and like the craft of smithing, and they've just lost their smith, right?
that's
And so
right.
what
Yeah,
happens is
interesting.
they're trying to get away from the harbor, but their anchor won't come up. So eventually, Brendan, like after 7 days of trying to get out of the harbor, things are just getting worse. And Brendan says, "All right, just cut the anchor. Let's get out of here." So they cut the anchor, but then, of course, that means they're in real trouble out in the open sea, and they don't can't make a new anchor
Yeah.
because the smith is dead. And so what Brendan does is that he blesses the hands of one of the priests that's on the ship with him, and the priest, even though he's never worked metal at all in his life, Brendan blesses his hands, and then he's able to forge a new anchor for the ship.
Hmm.
I know. It seems like all these
You can
things kind of
see
go
it, like
together,
it
but
kind of it. You can see how it makes sense. Like there's definitely something about, like you
yeah.
said,
And the way the smith's body becomes sort of like this anchor
this
point or like
anchor.
an island in the sea, and then they lose their anchor, but then they have this new one forged for them, and but it's made for them by the hands of this priest.
This priest.
Like I mean, it's so strange, but also like it feels like it's
Yeah, it
yeah,
has
like
something
it's
to
all
do with.
significant.
It has something to do with the yeah. It has something to do with the capacity to encounter all of this, like the possibility. Because the thing is that also related to the Book of Enoch and to the idea of the in between world. The smith is always an image of that, right? The smith is
Right.
an image of the of the descendants of Cain. The Vulcan type imagery. This idea of an in between. That's why Hephaestus is lame, because
Right.
he's incomplete, right? He's
Yeah,
not
he's
completely.
lame. He's a cripple. He's a hunchback. But not just Hephaestus, but like Wayland, who's like the northern European equivalent,
Yeah,
also like lame in one foot or maybe castrated.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Just like the Ethiopian eunuch, and so this image of the in between character. But for sure, like it would be worth meditating on how this comes together. Like, why is it that in dying or being willing to give up his soul, why does he become this why is he held in the waters,
yeah.
and then why do they lose their anchor, and why is it now has to be a priest that becomes a
That
blacksmith?
forges the new one, and it's like,
So
yeah.
you
I
could say
mean,
that, yeah, the idea of the priest forging a new anchor, that you can kind of understand what it is. It's saying, whatever, when we get to paradise,
right.
that the anchor has to be something that is pure, not something that is mitigated, not something that's in between. It has to be like, an anchor in the heart or something like
Right.
that. Like
Well,
that's
and
what
the
we
anchor
actually
is
need.
also this ancient symbol of Christ, right? That's like one of the early Paleo-Christian
Yeah, yeah,
symbols of,
yeah, yeah.
of Christianity is like the cruciform anchor.
Yeah, but man, this one I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of. It'd be
Yeah.
great for people to speculate in the comments and
Yeah,
tell us how you
absolutely.
see this coming together, because we can see it. It kind of glimmers through.
So, because we're at kind of like we've been going a long time, I think I'll just let me just tell a couple of stories to
Yeah.
kind of wrap up the voyage of Saint Brendan. And then, oh man, there's so many big like things where like they meet these sea monsters fighting, and then later they like the corpse of one of the sea monsters beaches and provides them a meal. So there's the whole like eating Leviathan thing.
Hmm.
Like I mean, there's just there's a lot of stories where they meet two monsters, but let me tell let me tell the story of okay, so Brendan makes it to paradise. Brendan makes it to paradise. Eventually, he makes it to the to paradise, as in the like the earthly makes it to the earthly
Yeah.
paradise, and he gets there, and uh, he spends some time there, and boy, I'm just skipping over so many different things. There's like a giant sea cat, and not sure if he's related to the island of mice that we hit at the beginning of the voyage, but in any case, he makes it to the land of promise, makes it to paradise, and he wants to stay there. And basically says, like, he's talking. There's this hermit there who lives there in paradise, obviously. Oh, but I mean, so paradise it's beautiful in all these different ways. It's also like totally silent. So you're not supposed to speak, because it's sort
Okay.
of like human speech is gonna it's gonna be dangerous. And
Tainted.
so Brendan and his monks, they're enjoined to kind of keep silent. And the only thing they do in paradise is pray the hours, actually. And so after the ninth hour, like basically like after the ninth hour in Vespers, Brendan finds out, okay, like you've spent one day in paradise, like one day praying the office in paradise. Now it's time for you to go back home because you have things you're supposed to do in Ireland. So he goes back home.
So wait, let me just. Is there any idea of who the hermit is? Like, is there some kind of hint of who the hermit is or what he's doing there?
Okay, all right, Jonathan.
And I'm
I mean,
just wondering if it's like
no, it's
Melchizedek or
okay. We really,
something.
I mean, like the whole voyage is for this, so we probably shouldn't skip over it. So let me tell you. There's so many different monster stories.
Because there's all these ideas of like maybe the idea of Shem going back to paradise or
Yeah,
Melchizedek, like all these
yeah.
weird legends.
So one day, when Brendan and his company were traversing and searching the sea, they happened upon the little country which they had been seeking for 7 years, to wit, the land of promise. As it says in the proverb, "He that seeketh will find."
And they found it in the 7th year.
Found it in the 7th year. Yeah, yeah. When that's why it seems like the original like intent is like first voyage 5 years, second voyage is 2 years, so 7 years total. When they came near to this land and were minded to take harbor there, they heard the voice of a certain elder speaking to them and saying, "O much travailed men, O holy pilgrims, O ye who look for the heavenly rewards, O ever toilsome life in laboring and waiting for this country, stay a little from your labor now." And when they had remained a little while at rest, the elder said unto them, "Dear brothers in Christ, do you not perceive this glorious and lovely land on which never was spilt the blood of man?" So remember, like, this is the whole kind of the reason they can't come in the garments of skin is because to get those you have to kill something. I think it's part of the idea, right?
For people should know that there are some liturgical traditions, in which you're not ever supposed to have animal parts on the altar in the church, and so
I mean,
that's why.
we don't allow leather. I mean,
You're not allowed to have a leather
yeah,
book on the like
right.
that goes directly on the altar.
Yeah. So, in which it is not fitting for any sinner or evildoer to be buried. By the way, the idea of burial is one of the main themes of the story. Like almost, a lot of the people that go on the voyage with Brendan, or a lot of people they run into, basically we just see them at the moment of their death, right? And that's when you meet them in this. So basically, but no sinner or evildoer can be buried here. Leave now everything you have on your boat except the clothes that you have on you, and come up hither. So they came to land, each of them kissed the other, and the elder wept greatly for his exceeding joy. "See and search and see," he said, "the borders and regions of paradise, where will be found health without sickness, pleasure without contention, union without quarrel, dominion without interruption, attendance of angels, feasting without diminution, meadows sweet in scent as fair and blessed flowers. Happy indeed is he whom Brendan, the son of Finlug, shall summon hither to join him," said the same elder, "to inhabit forever and ever the island in which we are." But when they saw paradise amid the waves of the sea, they marveled and were astonished at the wonders of God and his power when they saw these wonders. Now the elder was on this wise, without any human clothing at all, to get to your question.
Right.
Without any human clothing at all, but his body was covered in a white down like a dove or a sea mew, which is a gull. And his speech was almost like that of an angel. And they celebrated Tierce, the third hour, after the ringing of the bell, with the giving of thanks to God, and with their minds fixed on God, but they did not dare to ask any question. Then said the elder, "Let each of you pray privately without speech to any to any other of you, for this land is holy and angelic, and moreover sin commonly attaches to speech. For often in old world fables is there either sorrow or idle joy." Which are the two things that you're not allowed to have in paradise. There's no sorrow and there's no idle joy.
Yeah.
"We agree in truth," said the folk. When they had remained there thus for a while, the elder came to them and said, "Let us celebrate the midday office." That's the 6th hour. And when they had finished celebrating the midday office, Brendan asked the elder, "Is it God's will for me that I should remain here until the day of doom. That is the day of judgment, which again, the day of the judgment, the day of the resurrection, is always the day that's looming in the story.
Yeah.
And the elder answered him this wise: He who shall seek his own will opposes the will of God. And it is 60 years since I came hither,
Okay.
and the food of angels has fed me all that time. And my body is well nigh wasted away with old age. But it is not here that I grew old, but I continue at the age that I was when I came here. And Christ bade me to remain here to wait for thee another 30 years, in addition to that first 30. And now it is time for me to go to heaven, for thou hast come to me. And when you have celebrated Noon, that is the 9th hour, depart to your own land and instruct the men of Aaron, that is Ireland, for crimes and sins shall be corrected by thee. And Christ said to me at this hour of Noon, that thou shouldst come into this land with thy family, thy monks and nuns, together with the saints of Aaron, 7 years before the judgment, and with that marvelous anchor which the priest made for thee. So, 7 years before the day of judgment, Brendan is going to return with the anchor forged by the priest. I do not know what the heck that means, but this is what the hermit says.
I mean, clearly it has to do. For sure, then it's not a kind of. It's obviously not like a Melchizedek or some old character.
Yeah.
He's been there for 60 years, and also there's but he is in paradise. He's naked. It's like he is beatified, in that sense.
Yep.
And so I think that maybe what he's suggesting is something like this is for you as a visit, and then
for you this is a visit.
You need to you'll return, and then it will become your permanent abode, and that will be with the anchor, the right anchor, right? And you can anchor yourself in paradise. Because one of the things you see is that in some ways, you can think about it as like the Jesus prayer, right? Or this as a Jesus prayer, as this moving in and moving out of paradise, if you think about it that way, as this capacity to inhale, attention and spirit, but then you have to exhale. And that seems to be what's happening. He goes out and then he encounters these glimpses of paradise, and then he's told, okay, well, now you have to go back to your world, and then go back, and then you go out again, and then he gets closer, he actually gets the actual paradise, and he said, well, no, you have to go back, but then you will return, and then for good, like you will return with an anchor.
The curious thing is that, of course, the story ends with the death of St. Brendan. So the idea is that he's still going to come to this land with all the saints of Ireland 7 years before the day of judgment,
right,
with the anchor, right? And the theme that we kind of started with when we first started these videos on the Voyage of St. Brendan is this idea that the saints established the world. Mm-hmm. Right. And so like this idea of anchoring, this idea of like finding the place, right? Finding paradise, finding the place of silence, right? Finding the place of prayer and sort of establishing that seems to be one of the things that's going on here. I should also mention that this entire time they've been, I say this entire time, the whole second voyage, basically, their food has been brought to them every day by this bird, this shining bird that follows them. And brings them bread and fish for each man, and that's where their food is coming from. Mm-hmm. And so the shining bird brings them the food here on this island, and then the elder, this old hermit, partakes of the body and blood of Christ, and then sends his spirit to heaven. It says, doesn't die. He sends his spirit to heaven, and then they bury his body there on the island. And remember that no sinner can be buried here. This is paradise, right? And so, but the hermit, he's able to be buried there.
So the hermit dies.
Right? Yeah. He was there just waiting for Brendan, and now it's sort of very like Saint Simeon. Let your servant depart in peace.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So I mean, this is all like wonderfully mysterious, and you would stop the story here probably if you were writing it, because like, what else are you going to do? Well, it turns out a lot. And I just want to mention two. I know we're kind of like long, but
we can keep going. We've only been going for an hour.
Because I'm really having fun with this, and I just want to mention what happens when Saint Brendan comes to Britain.
Uh-huh.
So Brendan, to kind of summarize a little bit, Brendan goes back to Ireland and he starts setting things in order. And so we get a bunch of different miracles where he basically, and the theme of the miracles is basically that each one is there's injustice, and then Brendan balances the scales, right? And so one day, Brendan gets angry with this guy and he turns him into an otter, like you do. And this is connected with like kind of this famous old Irish poem about this otter who's like, so this is this man whose name means otter in Old Irish, and he kills one of Brendan's cows, and so he gets turned into an otter, and so he's like swimming in the river, and then his sons from when he was a human, they come to fish in the river, and he like sings to them out of the river, and that's the context for this poem, which also appears here in the life of Saint Brendan. But in any case, eventually the man dies, and Brendan kind of feels, it seems kind of bad that he turned this guy into an otter. And so he goes to his foster mother, Ita, and asks, what should I do about this? And she says, basically, you need to go to the island of Britain as sort of like a penance. And so he goes to the island of Britain, and there on the island of Britain, there is a I'm skipping so many things here. There on the island of Britain, is Saint Gildas. Saint Gildas, who's a famous Celtic saint, also from the same century. Mm-hmm. This century, the 6th century, is the century that produces like all the great Celtic, Irish, and Welsh saints. So he comes to the island of Britain, and there's Saint Gildas, and Gildas hears that Brendan is coming. And basically, he's heard stories about Brendan, but he wants to sort of test him and see if Brendan is legit, if he's the real deal, if he's really a holy man, etc. And so he has 7 iron bolts put on the doors of the monastery, and then he has iron bolts put on the doors of the church, and then he has this is very interesting and strange detail, but he has a liturgy book, a book with a liturgy in it, but it's in Greek, set on the altar of the church. And so Saint Brendan comes along, and right? So Saint Brendan comes along, and he just tells his attendant, like he doesn't even deal with the doors himself. He just tells his Telemach is his name. He's basically his servant. Tells him to open the doors, and so he goes and opens the doors, and the 7 iron bolts shatter. And then they get the doors of the church, and the iron bolts on the doors of the church shatter. Iron, I don't know, maybe it's a way of making sure Brendan's not a fairy or something like that. I'm not sure. Or it's just like a really, really strong lock. That's the idea. Mm-hmm. And then he gets into the middle of the church, and Gildas says, or at least the minister of the church says to Brendan, by the command of St. Gildas, he says, say mass, Brendan. And there he is, and the altar's all prepared, the vessels are on it, and there's a book on it with the liturgy, but the liturgy is written, we're told, in Greek letters. So the idea is that, how could you read it if you, and I there are people who are really interested in the idea that the Christianity, may have been brought to the Celtic people originally, maybe from somewhere in the east, like northern Egypt. There's books you can read about this. There's a new one that came out recently, and I wish I could remember the name of it. But I mean, you could say there's like a persuasive case to be made. So this might be a reference to that. It might also just be the idea that, hey, it's in Greek. How are you going to read Greek unless you're like a holy person? That kind of that Saint Brendan, as part of the powers that come with being a holy man, he's going to be able to read the liturgy in Greek. And so Brendan opens the book and reads out the liturgy. And then Gildas and his family, they receive communion at Brendan's hand. And just as they're about to do this, Gildas sees a human form, like the body of a little baby, on the paten, and human blood that smells, like coppery, like human blood in the chalice. And Gildas freaks out. Because as everybody knows in the ancient world, if you see this kind of miracle associated with the Eucharist, it is not a good thing. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you read the church fathers, St. John Chrysostom, he talks about the fact that Christ's body and blood comes to us as bread and wine is basically God sparing us, right? So if you see something like this, it's a sign of God's judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And so Gildas sees this and he says, vengeance is ready to fall upon me because I have reproached Brendan. In other words, the fact that he didn't trust Brendan, he didn't recognize him as a man of God. Now he's going to be judged. And so Brendan says, and this seems to be like part of the idea here is that Saint Gildas has violated the laws of Christian hospitality. That he's barred the church to a man of God who was
Right.
also a fellow priest, also a fellow monastic,
Yeah.
etc. And so Brendan says, I will protect thee from that vengeance, for though thou didst try the strangers, and this idea of, and it's weird that in this case, Brendan is the stranger. Like Brendan has been out on the edge and he's been like running into the stranger that you can integrate and baptize and the one that you can't and the one that's just poisonous. But now Brendan is the stranger.
Mm-hmm.
And so it says then, for though thou didst try the strangers, it is now the time of remission or forgiveness, that is, of going to receive the body of Christ. Then Brendan blessed the altar once more, and it was the body of Christ, the host, in other words, the bread that was on the paten, and the blood which was in the chalice became wine. And when the people of Gildas had communicated at the hands of Brendan, Brendan and his company remained there for 3 days and 3 nights. And after this, things are like pretty good between Brendan and Gildas, and Brendan does a bunch of miracles, related to like the taming of wild animals there and everything. So one day, Brendan is he's still there in the island of Britain, and he's building churches. And as he's building churches, he sees these 2 sea monsters which begin to fight in the sea. And then they take to the air, right? So they're, what's the flying version of amphibious? Like they're not land and sea, they're air and sea. But anyway, so these 2 sea monsters, they're fighting through the air, and one of them is just really giving the other sea monster a hard time. And the sea monster cries out, in the name of Saint Bridget, leave me alone. And so the other monster is like, oh, okay, well, if you're going to invoke Saint Bridget, I don't want that smoke. And so he flies away. And Brendan turns to his monks and says, we have to leave for Ireland right now so that I can go meet this Saint Bridget. Because how holy does she have to be that even the monsters are calling on her name? And he even says, and there's maybe a little bit of vanity here. I mean, it's always good.
She's alive, right, at this point.
Yeah, she's alive. I mean, again, all these big 6th century saints all lived right at the same time. Patrick overlaps with them as well. And he says, like, how holy must she be that the sea monsters even are calling on her name for intercession, and they're not mentioning Brendan, And so there's this kind of thing that happens sometimes in these stories where you've had this holy man who's been a holy man for a long time. There are stories like this about Saint Anthony the Great, for instance, where like you find out there's this other person that's even holier than you. So it's kind of like,
but it's not quite as known. It's not as famous.
Yeah, put you in your place, right? So they go to Ireland. They go back to Ireland, and they meet with Saint Bridget, and this is when, by the way, Saint Brendan composed the famous and celebrated hymn, Bridget, a woman ever good, which is referenced in the story and then not quoted because obviously we all know that hymn. But in any case,
I was gonna say like I don't know.
Yeah, me neither. I wish I did though. I wish we could find it because that would be pretty great. So Bridget comes to her, and then he says, tells her about the story of the conversation between the 2 monsters that he heard. Or Brendan comes to her, tells about the story of the conversation between the monsters, and then asks her, he says, what good, said he, dost thou do for God more than I, when the monsters entreat thee, even though absent, and me though present, they leave uninvoked. And Bridget says to Brendan, make thy confession. And so they basically make a confession to each other. And what Brendan says is that I have never crossed 7 furrows, like think about like a plowed field, right, with furrows in it. that I've and how long it would take you to walk across 7 furrows, which is like 3 or 4 steps, without turning my mind towards God. And then Brendan says to her, make your confession. And Bridget says that since I first fixed my mind on God, I've never taken it off and never will until the day of doom. Thou, however, said she, art so constantly incurring great danger by sea and by land that thou must needs give thy attention to it, and it is not because thou forgettest God that thy mind is fixed on him only at every 3rd furrow. So basically, it's like, Brendan, you've been...
Catch up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just like, listen, and it's kind of like, Brendan is this masculine saint, and he's out there, traveling and running into all these dangers, and obviously like raising the dead and casting out demons and all these other things. And then Bridget just stays in one place. But because she does that, because her mind is always fixed on God, right? And so we get another poem here. And Brendan goes back home. It moves between Britain and Ireland. The rest of the story is kind of focused on the different monasteries that Brendan establishes and the monastic rules that he puts in place. And when we come to the story of Brendan's repose, there's a story in here, by the way, about the rescue of a monk named Coleman after his death, like from hell through St. Brendan's prayers. And this whole section is basically about whether or not the prayer of Christians is if it's effective for the dead, right? Basically, why you should pray for the dead.
Brendan gets someone out of hell.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, yeah.
Just that, not a big deal.
Like you do.
Like
He actually doesn't just do that. He puts together a prayer rule, and this seems to be the origin story for the Irish Office of the Dead. Like, this is what you pray for souls who have recently reposed. There is no mention at this particular juncture of purgatory, but the idea is that the monk is kind of the worst monk, but through Brendan's prayers, he's delivered anyway from the fires of hell. So finally, we get to the story of Brendan's repose, which is where the story ends. Again, skipping a lot of details here, but Brendan is away from Clonfert, which is the monastery that he's found, and he says, this is where my resurrection is going to be. He's away from there when he's dying, and he knows he's about to die, and so he says, I need my body to be taken to Clonfert. That's where there will be an attendance of angels over it, and that's where my resurrection will take place. And so he leaves instructions, and the instructions are very particular. He says, first of all, just make a little wagon and put my body in the wagon, because if there's a large wagon, if there's a big attendance, everybody in Ireland's going to realize that's my body, and they're going to want to they're going to fight over my body, and you have to imagine the sort of the recently Christianized Irish tribes would definitely fight over it, and in fact did fight over the relics of saints. Like, it's something, a different state of affairs, one might say. Although it's not too difficult, actually, I think, to imagine the world that we live in, that if you really believed the relics of the saints are like holy things that would bring protection to your community and healing sickness and all these other things, like maybe you would fight to have that for your community. Not saying that's what we should do, but I don't think it's too hard to imagine. Anyway,
people pay a lot for more huge amounts for very ridiculous participation things.
Exactly. So he gives these instructions, and he says, when you're moving my body, a young man is going to show up with he's only got one eye, the left eye in particular, to speak precisely, who will meet the bearer of my body. And this guy is basically like a prince from one of the local tribes. And he will say to the brother who has the corpse, is that the body of the saint that thou hast? And he will say in a gruff voice, among us shall his resurrection be, give up the body. So he's saying people are going to come for my body. And there's going to be this thing that they have to offer. So first of all, you're going to offer him gold. And he's going to refuse that. Then you have to offer them the kingship and say, Brendan said you could have the kingship if you sort of leave his body alone. And he's going to refuse that. And then you say, I'm going to offer you heaven and earth, that is salvation. And then for those three things, for the gold, the kingship, and heaven and earth, he'll release it. And that's how the story goes. And so Brendan's body is taken to Clonfert, and in the year 581, according to the story, in the year 581, from the birth of the Son of Mary, we're assured to the extinction of Brendan's life was a year and a glorious 80 in addition to 500 complete. He dies, and the last thing that we're told about him is that the body of Brendan was then brought to Clonfert and buried there with great honor and reverence, with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs in honor of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And that's how Brendan dies. And Brendan is one of the 12 apostles of Ireland. He's one of the people who really establishes the Irish Church. His life is full of these strange, bizarre, amazing, wonderful stories that seem to be about these things which Celtic Christianity, and really all Christianity, I mean, that's the thing that I want to secretly do, is help people understand that when we're talking about the ancient church, there are these different flavors, but it's all part of a single cohesive whole. I mean, you could imagine the stories that I've told today and in the previous video, being the sort of stories that would show up in Ethiopian folklore and Christianity and hagiography, right? But also really anywhere kind of out on the edge.
Yeah.
And that these stories are really, they're part of our common inheritance, that and that they, by moving through kind of extremes like this, they show us the way that the saints establish the world, the way that they mediate between heaven and earth, and also kind of the wonderful variety that is between them, which is the wonderful thing. There's the opening line of not War and Peace, of the other Tolstoy novel, Anna Karenina, says something like, good people are all the same, but bad people are all different. Something, I'm butchering the opening line, but in any case, but it's exactly the other way around. Like, evil things, and this is what you see in the life of Saint Brendan, that all the evil things that you come across are very mundane, and they're very much, they're very banal, they're very much the same. But in the saints, between somebody like Brendan and somebody like Saint Bridget, who has her own hagiography, which is full of strange and wondrous happenings as well. But there's a very different character between them. They're two very different people and two different witnesses to what it looks like to live this life that is transparent to Jesus Christ in a place that could not be more different, but also couldn't be more similar to the world that we live in. So
awesome. Well, that's a great place to finish. Do we have?
Yeah.
Are there relics? Do they have Brendan's relics?
Relics of St. Brendan? I don't know the answer to that question. I know there are relics of St. Bridget, but there's a lot that was lost during the Reformation, so I'm not sure about that. I thought I would end this, if it's okay, by reading a poem.
All right.
So the poem is by J.R.R. Tolkien, and there's a couple of versions of it. The early version is called Imram, and then he later updated it and renamed it to The Death of St. Brendan. And it is about sort of Brendan's last moments. And I want to mention the story because we have this course that we're about to launch. It's coming later this month. It's going to be the first time that I've taught a course solo for Symbolic World, actually, but I'm really looking forward to it. And the course is called Tolkien and Universal History, The Symbolic World Goes to Middle Earth. We'll have a link down to it here in the doobly-doo. But in the doobly-doo, yeah. In that course, one of the things that I want to do is show people the secret ways that Tolkien's legendarium is actually a work, or it's an attempt at a work of universal history. And as part of that, it shows the way that Tolkien tries to take the story of the English people and the sort of the mythical ancestors of the English people and somehow make it fit into the ancient Christian identity of the British Isles, right? And that to be British and to be English are not actually the same thing. But Tolkien tried to sort of make them fit together in ways that people have not noticed or have not really paid attention to. And so this is one example of that. This is the death of St. Brendan. At last, out of the deep seas he passed, and mist rolled on the shore. Under clouded moon the waves were loud, as the laden ship him bore to Ireland, back to wood and mire, to the tower tall and grey, where the knell of Clonferta's bell tolled in the green Galway. Where Shannon down to Lucht Derg ran under a rain-clad sky, St. Brendan came to his journey's end, to await his hour to die. O tell me, Father, for I loved you well, if still you have words for me of things strange in the remembering, in the long and lonely sea, of islands by deep spells beguiled, where dwell the elven kind. In 7 long years the road to heaven, or the living land did you find? The things I have seen, the many things, have long now faded far. Only 3 come clear now back to me: a cloud, a tree, a star. We sailed for a year and a day, and hailed no field or coast of mean, nor boat nor bird saw we ever afloat for 40 days and 10. We saw no sun nor at set or dawn, but a dun cloud lay ahead, and a drumming there was like a thunder coming, and a gleam of fiery red. Upreared from the cloud upreared from the sea to cloud, then sheer, a shoreless mountain stood. Its sides were black from the sullen tide to the red lining of its hood. No cloak of cloud, nor lowering smoke, no looming storm of thunder in the world of men saw I ever unfurled like the pall that we passed under. We turned away, and we left astern the rumbling and the gloom. Then the smoking cloud asunder broke, and we saw the Tower of Doom. In its ashen head was a crown of red, where the fishes flamed and fell. As tall as a column in high heaven's hall, its feet were deep as hell. Grounded in chasms the water drowned and buried long ago, it stands, I ween, in forgotten lands, where the kings of kings lie low. We say, by the way, it's amazing that the episodes that Tolkien is describing here in his poem are ones that we read, but Tolkien is like very consciously interpreting them like as having to do with, the fall of Numenor, which is also like the flood and the fall of the kings and all these things. We sailed then on till the wind had failed, and we toiled then with the oar, and hunger and thirst us sorely wrung, and we sang our psalms no more. A land at last with a silver strand at the end of strength we found. The waves were singing in pillared caves, and pearls lay on the ground. And steep the shores went upward leaping to slopes of green and gold, and a stream out of rich and teeming through a combe of shadow rolled. Through gates of stone we rode in haste, and passed and left the sea, and silence like dew fell in that isle, and holy it seemed to be, as a green cup deep in a brim of green, that with wine the white sun fills, was the land we found, and we saw there stand on a lawn between the hills a tree more fair than ever I deemed might climb in paradise. Its foot was like a great tower's root, its height beyond men's eyes. So wide its branches the least could hold in shade an acre long, and they rose as steep as mountain snows, those boughs so broad and strong. For white as winter to my sight the leaves of that tree were, they grew more close than swan-wing plumes, all long and soft and fair. We deemed then, maybe, as in a dream, that time had passed away, and our journey ended, for no return we hoped, but there to stay. In the silence of that hollow isle, in the stillness then we sang, softly as seemed, but the sound aloft like a pealing organ rang. Then trembled the tree from crown to stem, from the limbs that leaves in air, the leaves in air, as white birds fled in wheeling flight and left the branches bare. Now, this part of the story comes from a different version of the story of St. Brendan than the one that I read to you. From the sky came dropping down on high a music not of a bird, not voice of man nor angel's voice, but maybe there is a third fair kindred in the world yet lingers beyond the foundered land. Yet steep are the seas and the waters deep beyond the white sea strand. Oh, stay now, Father, there's more to say, but 2 things you have told, the tree, the cloud, but you spoke of a third, the star in mind you hold? The star, yes, I saw it high and far, at the parting of the ways, a light on the edge of the outer night, like silver set ablaze, where the round world plunges steeply down, but on the old road goes, as an unseen bridge that on the arches runs to coasts that no man knows. But men say, Father, that ere the end you went where none have been. I would hear you tell me, Father dear, of the last land that you have seen. In my mind The star I can still find, and the parting of the seas, and the breath as sweet and keen as death that was born upon the breeze. But where they bloom, those flowers fair, in what air or land they grow, what words beyond the world I heard, if you would seek to know, in a boat then, brother, far afloat, you must labor on the sea, and find for yourself things out of mind. You will learn no more of me. In Ireland, over wood and mire, in the tower tall and grey, the knell of Clonferta's bell was tolling in green Galway. St. Brendan had come to his life's end under a rain-clad sky, and journeyed whence no ship returns, but his bones in Ireland lie. Anyway, it's a lovely poem. I mean, I always read it on the Feast of St. Brendan every year, but we're going to get into it and look at the versions of the story of St. Brendan's life that Tolkien was reading and how he tries to connect them into, for instance, this idea of maybe there's a third fair kindred that in the world yet lingers. So that's something to look forward to. I hope folks will join us for Tolkien and Universal History. And I've talked a lot, Jonathan, so...
This is great. As usual, surprises all abound and amazing stories. And so, yeah, people show up. It would be great to see Richard try to, Richard has talked so much about Tolkien, but it'd be wonderful to see him really try to frame it within our universal history arrow. So, yeah. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.